I'm Jessica, 24 years old, sitting alone in my small apartment on what should be a celebration. Today's my birthday, but my phone remains silent. 2 weeks ago, my mother screamed words that keep echoing in my mind, "Get out and never come back." So I did exactly that. The numbness I feel now is almost comforting, like an emotional anesthetic protecting me from the pain of family abandonment. Can families truly stop loving each other so quickly? Then came the text from Dad that changed everything. "Why have you stopped coming around?" What he doesn't know is that I'm simply following Mom's orders. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt the sting of family rejection. Growing up, I believed my family was perfect. My parents, Diane and Thomas, have been married for 30 years. My older brother Kyle completed our family unit, the golden child who could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. Before everything fell apart, my mother and I were actually quite close, or at least I thought we were. Mom and I had our traditions. Every Saturday, we'd go shopping together at the local mall, browse through clothing stores, and stop for lunch at our favorite cafe. She'd help me choose outfits, sometimes being a bit too opinionated about my style, but I appreciated her input back then. We shared an interest in cooking, and she taught me all her secret family recipes, standing side by side in the kitchen as we prepared Sunday dinners together. But things began to shift when I went to college. The distance between us wasn't just physical. Her calls became more frequent, almost invasive. She wanted to know every detail of my day, who I was spending time with, and would often disapprove of my new friends without even meeting them. What I once saw as caring interest revealed itself as controlling behavior. "Jessica, are you really wearing that to your presentation?" She'd ask during our video calls, frowning at my outfit choice. "And who is this new friend Amber? She doesn't sound like a good influence." My father was rarely present for these interactions. Dad worked 60-hour weeks at his law firm, coming home just in time for dinner before retreating to his home office. He was non-confrontational to a fault, always defaulting to listen to your mother whenever I tried to involve him in our disagreements. Emotionally, he was as distant as the moon, showing up for important events but never really being present. The real turning point came when I declared my major in graphic design during sophomore year. Mom had always pushed me toward medicine, convinced I would follow in Kyle's footsteps. "Graphic design? That's not a real career, Jessica." "It's a hobby," she'd said dismissively. "Kyle knew what he wanted to do by your age and stuck with it. Now look at him." Kyle. My brother is 5 years older, a successful cardiologist who married his college sweetheart Bethany. They have 2 perfect children and live in a beautiful house just 15 minutes from our parents. Every achievement of his was celebrated like a national holiday, while my accomplishments were treated as pleasant surprises at best. "We never expected you to make Dean's List," Mom had said when I shared my academic success, somehow turning a compliment into an insult. Still, I tried. For years, I maintained the relationship despite the growing strain. I came home for weekly Sunday dinners, called regularly, and participated in family events. I sought her approval even while building my independence, a balancing act that became increasingly difficult. The last 6 months, though, something changed. Mom became more critical than usual, easily angered by minor issues, and unpredictable in her responses. One day she'd be almost normal, the next she'd fly into a rage because I loaded the dishwasher incorrectly. I began to suspect something deeper was happening in my parents' marriage. Dad seemed more withdrawn than usual, and Mom would sometimes make cryptic comments about "your father's priorities." They would exchange glances I couldn't interpret, conversations stopping when I entered rooms. 3 months ago, we had a family dinner that served as a preview of the disaster to come. Kyle was bragging about his new research grant, and Mom was practically glowing with pride. When I mentioned a logo design I'd created for a small business that had been featured in a local magazine, Mom nodded distractedly. "That's nice, dear. Kyle, tell us more about your research." Dad caught my eye across the table and gave me a small, apologetic smile. It was the first time I clearly recognized the pattern we were stuck in, roles we'd been assigned in our family drama. Kyle was the star, I was the supporting character, Mom was the director, and Dad was the silent producer who funded the whole operation. In the weeks before the incident, tensions were building. Mom canceled our Saturday shopping trip twice without explanation. Dad was working later than usual. Kyle was too busy with his perfect life to notice anything amiss. And I was growing increasingly frustrated with being treated like an afterthought in my own family. The Sunday that changed everything started normally enough. I arrived at my parents' suburban home at 5 p.m. sharp, the same time I'd been arriving for dinner for years. I was actually excited because I'd received a promotion at the design agency where I'd been working since graduation. After 2 years as a junior designer, I was now being moved up to a full designer position with my own clients and a significant pay raise. The house smelled of roast chicken and rosemary potatoes, Mom's specialty. Kyle and his family hadn't arrived yet, which was unusual. Dad was in his usual spot in the living room, reading the newspaper. "Where's Kyle?" I asked after greeting my parents. "He and Bethany had a conflict tonight. Tyler has a school event," Mom explained, referring to my nephew. "It'll just be us three." I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe with Kyle absent, there would be space for my news to be appreciated. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Mom had set the table with the good china, which struck me as odd for just the three of us. Dad asked about my week, and I seized the opportunity. "Actually, I have some exciting news," I said, unable to keep the smile from my face. "I got promoted at work. I'm now a full designer with my own client list." Dad looked up from his plate with genuine interest. "That's wonderful, Jess. Congratulations." I turned to Mom, waiting for her reaction. For a moment, her face was blank, unreadable. Then she simply said, "The potatoes need more salt," and passed the salt shaker to Dad. The dismissal stung, but I pressed on. "It comes with a significant raise too. I'm thinking of looking for a better apartment, maybe in the downtown area." Mom's fork clattered against her plate. "Downtown? That area isn't safe for a young woman alone." "Mom, it's perfectly safe. There are security buildings, and it would cut my commute in half." "I don't think it's a good idea," she said firmly. "Besides, you should be saving your money, not spending it on expensive rent. You never know when this design thing might not work out." "This design thing is my career," I said, feeling heat rise to my face. "And it's working out great. My creative director specifically mentioned that my work has brought in new clients." Mom took a sip of her water. "Well, that's nice. Did I tell you Carl just published another paper? His research might lead to a new procedure for heart valve repairs." Just like that, the conversation shifted away from my achievement to Kyle's. It was such a familiar pattern that I almost let it go, as I always had before. But something in me had reached its breaking point. "Mom," I said firmly, "I was telling you about my promotion. Can we stay on that topic for just 5 minutes before switching to Kyle?" The tension in the room thickened instantly. Dad's eyes darted between us, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "I'm just saying," Mom continued as if I hadn't spoken, "that Kyle has established a real career. Something stable and respected. Not drawing pictures for businesses that might close next year." "I don't just draw pictures," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I create visual branding that helps businesses succeed. My work has real value." "Of course it does, dear," she said in that patronizing tone that made me feel like a child. "But it's not saving lives, is it?" "Not everyone needs to save lives to have worth," I countered. Mom's expression hardened. "I just want what's best for you. You could have gone to medical school. You had the grades. But you chose this creative path instead. Because it's what I love and what I'm good at." "Love doesn't pay the bills," she snapped. "And speaking of love, how's Daniel? Another relationship fizzled out?" The sudden change of subject hit me like a slap. Daniel and I had broken up just 3 weeks earlier after 8 months together. It had been painful but mutual, as we wanted different things long term. I'd mentioned it briefly to my parents but hadn't gone into details. That's not relevant to this conversation, I said stiffly. It is when we're discussing stability. You're 24, Jessica. At your age, I was already married to your father with Kyle on the way. But you can't seem to maintain a relationship for more than a few months. Maybe if you focused less on your career and more on building a real life. My career is part of my real life, I interrupted, feeling tears threatening. And my relationship with Daniel ended because we wanted different futures, which is a mature reason to break up. I won't apologize for not being married with children at 24. Mom's face flushed with anger. Don't take that tone with me, young lady. I'm trying to help you. Someone needs to point out that you're making one mistake after another. The only mistake I'm making is expecting you to be happy for me, I said, pushing my chair back from the table. Just once, I'd like you to be proud of me for who I actually am, not disappointed that I'm not Kyle. Dad finally intervened. Let's all calm down. Jessica, your mother doesn't mean. Yes, she does, I cut him off. She absolutely means it. Nothing I do will ever be good enough because I'm not following her exact life plan for me. Mom stood up so quickly her chair nearly toppled backward. Her face had transformed into something I barely recognized, twisted with rage that seemed disproportionate to our argument. You ungrateful, disrespectful child, she shouted, her voice echoing in the dining room. After everything we've done for you. We paid for your education, supported you when you insisted on this art career, and this is how you speak to me? Mom, I'm just asking you to acknowledge my success on my terms, I tried to explain, shocked by her outburst. Success? She laughed, a harsh sound with no humor. You call this success? Living in a tiny apartment, jumping from one relationship to another, making logos for coffee shops? You've been a disappointment from the day you chose to waste your potential. The words hit me like physical blows. Dad sat frozen, his face pale. Diane, he said weakly, that's enough. But Mom was beyond hearing him. She pointed at the door, her finger shaking with rage. Get out, she hissed. Get out and never come back. If we're such terrible parents, if your life is so perfect without our input, then go live it. You're no longer welcome in this house. I stood there in shock, unable to process what was happening. This was beyond our normal arguments. This was something else entirely. Mom, you don't mean that, I whispered. I've never meant anything more in my life, she said, her voice suddenly cold and controlled. Get out. Now. I looked at my father, silently pleading for intervention, but he sat with his head bowed, saying nothing. In that moment, his silence hurt almost as much as my mother's words. With shaking hands, I grabbed my purse. Tears blurred my vision as I walked to the door. I paused, waiting for someone to stop me, to say this was all a terrible misunderstanding. No one did. I walked out to my car, my entire body feeling numb and disconnected. As I drove away from my childhood home, the physical sensations hit me all at once, my racing heart, the cold sweat on my skin, the tightness in my chest making it hard to breathe. I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see through my tears. My mother had just disowned me over a dinner conversation. And my father had let it happen. I don't remember much about the drive back to my apartment that night. Muscle memory must have taken over because somehow I arrived home safely despite barely being able to see through my tears. My hands trembled so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock my door. Once inside, I collapsed onto my couch, the silence of my apartment pressing in around me. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, searching for what I could have said or done differently. Had I been disrespectful? Was my tone too harsh? Did I miss some important context that would explain my mother's extreme reaction? My phone remained dark and silent that night. No calls from Dad checking if I'd made it home safely. No apologetic text from Mom saying she'd overreacted. Nothing. I barely slept, and when morning came, I called in sick to work for the first time since I'd started there. I couldn't face explaining to anyone what had happened when I could barely understand it myself. By the second day, shock had given way to grief. I cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat raw. This wasn't just an argument, it was a severing of family ties. The words "never come back" kept echoing in my head like a cruel mantra. On the third day, I felt the first stirrings of anger. How dare she speak to me that way? How dare she dismiss my career, my relationships, my entire life as worthless? And how dare my father sit there in silence, neither defending me nor trying to defuse the situation? By the end of the first week, I'd moved into a state of numb resignation. I kept expecting my phone to ring with a call from one of my parents, but it never did. I'd always been the one to reach out after our arguments in the past, the one to apologize even when I wasn't wrong. This time, I decided I would respect my mother's command. She told me to never come back, and I wouldn't. My friend Stephanie noticed something was wrong when we met for our regular Wednesday coffee. "You look like hell, Jess," she said bluntly. "What's going on?" I broke down and told her everything. It was the first time I'd spoken the words aloud, and hearing myself describe the incident made it even more surreal. "Your mom said what?" Stephanie exclaimed, drawing glances from nearby tables. "That's not normal, Jess. That's not just a bad day or a misunderstanding. That's emotional abuse." I'd never thought of my relationship with my mother in those terms before, but Stephanie's words forced me to reflect on the patterns that had defined our interactions for years. The conditional love based on compliance with her expectations. The comparisons to Kyle. The subtle and not-so-subtle undermining of my choices and achievements. "I think you should talk to someone professional about this," Stephanie suggested gently. "This isn't just about one blow-up. This is about a lifetime of dynamics that aren't healthy." She was right. The next day, I made an appointment with a therapist. It was something I should have done years ago. Work became my sanctuary. I threw myself into my new responsibilities, staying late at the office rather than returning to my empty apartment where thoughts of my family situation would overwhelm me. My creative director noticed my increased hours but mistook it for enthusiasm about my promotion. "Jessica, we love your dedication, but don't burn yourself out," she cautioned. The first Sunday after the incident was the hardest. For years, Sunday evening meant family dinner. As 5 p.m. approached, I felt physically ill, my body conditioned to expect that weekly ritual. I ordered takeout and ate alone, trying to establish new patterns for myself. I started a journal at my therapist's suggestion, documenting memories of my relationship with my mother over the years. The exercise revealed patterns I'd normalized. The criticism disguised as concern, the love that seemed directly proportional to my compliance, the way she could make me feel simultaneously special and inadequate. As days turned into weeks, I began building a life that didn't revolve around seeking my mother's approval or managing her expectations. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected because Mom didn't approve of them. I took a weekend workshop in digital illustration that I'd been interested in but had put off. Small steps toward independence that shouldn't have felt revolutionary but somehow did. Then came my birthday. I woke up with a hollow feeling in my chest, wondering if today would be the day they'd reach out. Birthdays had always been important in our family, celebrated with special dinners and thoughtful gifts. Surely this occasion would override whatever had happened. But my phone remained silent all day. No call. No text. No card in the mail. The final confirmation that my mother had meant exactly what she said. I was no longer welcome in the family. And my father, through his silence, had co-signed her decision. That night, sitting alone in my apartment with a single cupcake I'd bought myself, I made peace with my new reality. I had to accept that the family I thought I had was gone, if it had ever really existed at all. 2 weeks and 3 days after the incident, yes, I was counting, I was at my desk at work, finalizing a logo design for a new client. It was a busy Tuesday morning, phones ringing, colleagues chatting, the pleasant buzz of a creative workspace in full swing. My new normal. My phone vibrated with a text notification. Probably Stephanie confirming our plans for the weekend, I thought as I absently reached for it. The name on the screen made my heart skip, Dad. With trembling fingers, I opened the message, "Haven't seen you at dinner lately. Why have you stopped coming around?" I stared at those words, reading them over and over, certain I must be misunderstanding. Was this some kind of cruel joke? Had he somehow forgotten what happened? Or was this his awkward attempt at reconciliation? I set my phone down and tried to focus on my work, but the message consumed my thoughts. The casual tone was what disturbed me most. Why have you stopped coming around? As if I'd simply decided to skip family dinner for no reason. As if I hadn't been ordered to leave and never return. For hours, I debated how to respond. Should I be direct? Sarcastic? Should I ignore it completely? By lunch, I realized there was something deeper happening. The message suggested my father either didn't know what had happened or was pretending it hadn't. Neither scenario made sense unless my mother hadn't told him about our argument. But how was that possible? He was sitting right there. I couldn't resolve this via text. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside the office and called him. He answered on the third ring. "Jessica. Good to hear from you." His cheerful tone increased my confusion. "Dad," I said carefully, "I got your text asking why I stopped coming to dinner." "Yes," he replied, sounding genuinely puzzled. "Your mother said you've been too busy with your new position to join us. But it's been almost 3 weeks now. Everything okay?" I felt like I'd stepped into an alternate reality. "Dad," I said slowly, "do you not remember what happened at dinner 3 weeks ago?" A pause. "What do you mean? Did something happen?" My mind raced. Was he gaslighting me? Had he somehow blocked the entire incident from his memory? Or had he truly not heard what Mom said to me? "Dad, Mom and I had a huge fight. She told me to get out and never come back. You were sitting right there." The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Jessica, what are you talking about? I don't remember any fight like that." "It was about my promotion," I prompted. "Mom got angry when I stood up for myself. She said I was ungrateful and disrespectful, and then she told me to get out and never come back. You were at the table with us." Another long pause. "I remember you telling us about your promotion," he said slowly. "But I had to take a work call during dinner. I was in my office for at least 15 minutes. When I came back, your mother said you'd left early because of a work emergency. She's been telling everyone you're just too busy to come to dinner lately." The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't heard the argument. He hadn't witnessed my mother disowning me. All this time, he'd been operating under the assumption that I was simply busy with work. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking, "that's not what happened. At all." I could hear his breathing change, becoming more rapid. "Jessica, I think we need to talk about this in person. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow? Not at the house. Somewhere else." The request surprised me. Dad had never suggested meeting one-on-one before. Our relationship had always been mediated through Mom. "Yes," I agreed after a moment's hesitation. "The coffee shop on Main Street? The one near your office? Perfect. Noon? I'll be there." After hanging up, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process this new information. My father hadn't deliberately ignored my mother's outburst, he simply hadn't been present for it. And my mother had created a completely different narrative about my absence. The question was, why? The coffee shop was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived the next day. I spotted my father immediately, sitting at a corner table, looking oddly small and vulnerable without the backdrop of his home office or the family dinner table. He was wearing his work suit but seemed disheveled, his tie slightly crooked, his hair not as neatly combed as usual. I ordered a latte and joined him, an awkward silence falling between us as I settled into my seat. It struck me that this might be the first time we'd met like this, just the two of us, since I was a child and he'd occasionally take me for ice cream after my dance recitals. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his fingers tapping nervously on his coffee cup. "I need to understand what happened. What exactly did your mother say to you?" I took a deep breath and recounted the argument in detail, my news about the promotion, Mom's dismissal, the escalation when I stood up for myself, and finally, her command for me to get out and never return. As I spoke, my father's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a profound sadness that aged him before my eyes. "I don't understand," he said when I finished. "That doesn't sound like your mother at all." "Dad," I said gently, "this isn't the first time she's been hypercritical or dismissive of my choices. It's just the first time she's gone this far." He shook his head. "No, you don't understand. Your mother can be opinionated, yes, but she loves you deeply. She wouldn't disown you over a disagreement about your career. She's proud of you, Jessica. She tells her friends about your design work all the time." This revelation stunned me. "She does?" Dad nodded. "All the time. She has a folder of your designs on her iPad that she shows people." None of this aligned with my experience of my mother, especially in recent months. Then why does she constantly compare me to Kyle? Why does she dismiss my work to my face? Dad stared into his coffee, seemingly gathering his thoughts or perhaps his courage. When he looked up, his eyes were damp. "Jessica, there's something you need to know. Something we've kept from you and Kyle." He took a shaky breath. "Your mother has been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. We got the diagnosis about 8 months ago." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Of all the explanations I had considered, this hadn't even crossed my mind. "Dementia?" I repeated stupidly. "But she's only 58. Early onset can begin in the 50s, he explained. "We noticed small things at first: forgetting appointments, misplacing items, mood changes. When she started getting lost driving to places she's known for years, I convinced her to see a doctor." I thought back to the cancelled shopping trips, the increased irritability, the unpredictable reactions. Suddenly, they took on a completely different meaning. "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, feeling a complex mix of emotions: shock, sadness, but also a growing anger that such critical information had been withheld. Dad ran a hand over his face. "It was your mother's decision. She didn't want to be treated differently, especially by you kids. She is, so proud and independent. The diagnosis devastated her. She made me promise to keep it private while she processed it." "But Dad, how could you keep this from us? We're her family. We could have helped. We could have understood when she was acting differently." He looked ashamed. "I know. It was wrong. I've been trying to manage everything: her care, my work, the household, and I've been failing at all of it. I thought I could handle it alone, protect her dignity like she wanted. But it's gotten worse faster than the doctors initially predicted." A terrible thought occurred to me. Does she even remember what she said to me? Does she remember telling me to never come back? Dad shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. When I mentioned you weren't coming to dinner anymore, she seemed genuinely confused. She told me you were just busy with work, and I think she believes that's the truth." The irony was almost too much to bear. I'd spent weeks feeling abandoned by my family, when in reality, my mother might not even remember disowning me. "The thing is, Jessica," Dad continued, his voice breaking slightly, "she's having more good days than bad right now, but the doctors say that will change. There will come a time when she might not recognize us at all." I felt tears streaming down my face, unchecked. "Why have you been handling this alone? Why didn't you at least tell me when I stopped coming to dinner?" "I've been in denial myself," he admitted. "And I've been so focused on her that I haven't been paying attention to much else." I didn't even notice she'd stopped coming until Kyle mentioned it last Sunday. He reached across the table and took my hand. I'm so sorry, Jessica. I failed you as a father. For the first time, I saw my father not as the distant, work-obsessed man I'd grown up with, but as someone drowning under the weight of an impossible situation. Does Kyle know now? I asked. No, Dad sighed. Your mother still doesn't want anyone to know. She's particularly adamant about keeping it from Kyle. She doesn't want to distract him from his career or burden him with worry. Kyle should know, I said firmly. And I think you need help, Dad. You can't manage this alone. He nodded wearily. I know. I'm starting to realize that. He looked at me with pleading eyes. Would you consider coming back to dinner this Sunday? I know it's a lot to ask after what happened, but your mother asked about you this morning. It was a good day for her, and she specifically said she missed seeing you. My heart constricted painfully in my chest. How could I reconcile the mother who told me to never come back with this woman suffering from a disease that was stealing her mind? I don't know, Dad, I said honestly. This is a lot to process. I need some time. Of course, he said quickly. Take all the time you need. Just, please don't disappear completely. Your mother loves you, Jessica. The real her, underneath the disease, loves you very much. As we parted, he hugged me tightly, something he rarely did. I'm proud of you too, you know, he whispered. Your promotion, your independence, you've become a remarkable young woman. I watched him walk away, his shoulders stooped under the burden he'd been carrying alone. The father I'd always seen as emotionally unavailable was actually fighting a private battle I knew nothing about. And my mother, the woman whose approval I'd sought my entire life, whose rejection had devastated me, was waging a war against her own mind, losing pieces of herself day by day. Nothing was as it had seemed. The revelation about my mother's condition left me reeling. I called in sick for the afternoon, unable to focus on work, and went home to try to make sense of everything I'd learned. My first instinct was to research. I spent hours online, reading about early-onset dementia, its symptoms, progression, and treatment options. The more I read, the more I recognized behaviors I'd noticed in my mother over the past year, the mood swings, the forgetfulness she'd tried to cover up, the occasional confusion about simple tasks. One article particularly caught my attention. Personality changes are common in dementia patients. Someone who was once gentle and kind may become angry and aggressive, especially when confused or frustrated. Often, the person is unaware of these changes in themselves. Could that explain the extreme nature of our last argument? Had she truly not been herself when she told me to never come back? The possibility both comforted and disturbed me. The next day, I had my regular appointment with Dr. Lewis, my therapist. I'd been seeing her weekly since the incident, but now I had an entirely new context to discuss. It changes everything and nothing, I told her after explaining my father's revelation. On one hand, it helps explain her behavior. On the other hand, it doesn't erase the years of criticism and conditional approval that came before the diagnosis. Dr. Lewis nodded thoughtfully. Both things can be true simultaneously. Your mother's condition may be exacerbating tendencies that were already there. And you're allowed to have complex feelings about this situation, compassion for her illness while still protecting yourself from harmful interactions. I don't know what to do about Sunday dinner, I admitted. Dad wants me to come back, but I'm afraid of another explosion. And honestly, I'm angry that they kept this from me. I could have been more understanding if I'd known what was happening. What would going back to dinner mean to you? She asked. I considered the question carefully. It would mean facing the possibility of more hurt, but also potentially reconnecting with my mother during the time she has left with her full faculties. It would mean supporting my father, who's clearly struggling. But it would also mean potentially falling back into old patterns and expectations. Is there a middle path? Dr. Lewis suggested. A way to reconnect without fully returning to previous dynamics? The question stayed with me for days as I weighed my options. I discussed it with Stephanie over dinner that weekend. You know, I'm the first person to advocate cutting toxic family members out of your life, she said, gesturing with her fork for emphasis. But this situation is different. Your mom has a medical condition that's affecting her behavior. But she's always been critical and dismissive, I pointed out. The dementia didn't create that tendency, it just removed her filter. True, Stephanie conceded. But knowing what you know now, could you live with yourself if you stayed away completely? Especially given how the disease will progress? It was the question I'd been avoiding. Despite everything, could I really cut my mother out of my life now that I knew she was ill? Could I live with that decision years from now, looking back? I thought about my mother before the recent changes, demanding and critical, yes, but also the woman who taught me to bake, who nursed me through childhood illnesses, who cried with pride at my high school graduation. Somewhere beneath the disease, that woman still existed. At the same time, I couldn't simply pretend the hurt hadn't happened or expose myself to more emotional damage without protection. Over the next few days, I developed what I called my boundaries plan, a framework for how I would approach reconnecting with my family while protecting my emotional well-being. 1. I would attend Sunday dinner, but not every week, perhaps twice a month to start. 2. I would drive myself so I could leave if things became uncomfortable. 3. I would not engage in arguments about my career or personal choices. 4. I would speak to Kyle about our mother's condition, regardless of my parents' wishes to keep it secret. 5. I would continue therapy to process my feelings about the situation. 6. I would find a support group for families dealing with dementia. The plan gave me a sense of control in an uncontrollable situation. I could show compassion for my mother's condition without sacrificing my own needs in the process. After a week of reflection, I texted my father, "I'll come to dinner this Sunday. There are things we need to discuss as a family." His response came immediately, "Thank you, Jessica. This means more than you know." As Sunday approached, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I prepared myself for various scenarios. Mom might not remember our argument at all. She might be having a bad day and lash out again. She might be confused about why I'd been absent. The night before the dinner, I practiced self-care rituals my therapist had recommended: meditation, journaling, and setting clear intentions for the interaction. I reminded myself that I was no longer the child seeking approval but an adult making a compassionate choice from a position of strength. Whatever happened at dinner, I would face it on my terms. Sunday arrived with an unseasonable downpour, the dark skies and pounding rain matching my turbulent emotions. I dressed carefully in an outfit that made me feel confident: black jeans, a blue blouse my mother had once complimented, and the silver earrings that had been a gift from my father on my 21st birthday. As I drove to my parents' house, my stomach knotted with anxiety. I hadn't been back since that night 3 weeks ago when I'd fled in tears, believing I'd been disowned. Now I was returning with knowledge that changed everything, yet resolved to maintain the boundaries I'd established for myself. Dad must have been watching for me because he opened the front door before I even rang the bell. His relief at seeing me was palpable, written in the relaxing of his shoulders and the tentative smile that softened his tired face. "Jessica," he said simply, embracing me awkwardly. "Thank you for coming." The house smelled the same: Mom's signature roast chicken and rosemary potatoes, the scent now carrying a bittersweet nostalgia. I heard voices from the dining room and froze. "Kyle's here," Dad explained, noticing my hesitation. "And Bethany and the kids. Your mother's having a good day today." I nodded, taking a deep breath to steady myself. How should I act? Does she remember our argument? Dad shook his head. She hasn't mentioned it. Just follow her lead, okay? If she seems confused at any point, don't correct her directly. It can lead to agitation. This was all so surreal, receiving instructions on how to interact with the woman who had raised me. I stepped into the dining room, and 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me. "Jessica." Kyle's wife Bethany rose to greet me with a hug. "We've missed you." My brother nodded in agreement, though his expression suggested mild confusion about why my absence was noteworthy. My nephew Tyler, age 8, and niece Lily, age 5, barely looked up from their tablets. And then there was Mom, sitting at her usual place at the head of the table. She looked normal. The same neatly styled hair, the same carefully applied makeup, the same attentive posture. Only now, knowing what I knew, I could see the subtle signs, the slightly vacant look that occasionally passed over her eyes, the way she sometimes paused as if searching for words. "Jessica," she said, her tone giving no indication of our last interaction. "You're late. We were about to start without you." I was actually 5 minutes early, but I let it pass. "Sorry, Mom." The rain slowed me down. She nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, sit down. Tell us about your work. Anything new happening?" The directness of the question threw me. The last time I'd shared work news, it had ended in disaster. I glanced at Dad, who gave me an encouraging nod. "Actually, yes," I said carefully as I took my seat. "I got a promotion a few weeks ago. I'm now a full designer with my own clients." "That's wonderful, dear," Mom said, and to my shock, she sounded genuinely pleased. "I always said you had talent." "Didn't I always say that, Thomas?" Dad nodded, relief evident in his expression. "You did, Diane." Kyle raised an eyebrow at me across the table, clearly surprised by our mother's positive reaction to my career news. I gave him a look that I hoped conveyed, "I'll explain later." Dinner proceeded with an air of forced normalcy. Mom asked appropriate questions about my work, Kyle talked about his research, Bethany discussed the children's school activities. It was as if the explosive argument had never happened, which was both a relief and deeply unsettling. There were moments, though, when I glimpsed what Dad was dealing with. Mom referred to our neighbor Mr. Patterson, who had moved away 2 years ago, as if he still lived next door. She repeated the same question about my apartment twice within 10 minutes. She momentarily confused Tyler's name with Kyle's. Each time, Dad gently redirected the conversation without drawing attention to the lapse. It was a dance he had clearly been practicing, this careful protection of her dignity. After dinner, while Kyle and Bethany took the children into the backyard to play, I helped Mom clear the table, a routine we'd followed for years. As we stood side by side in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, she suddenly stopped and looked at me with unusual intensity. "You haven't been here in a while," she said, a hint of confusion in her voice. My heart raced. "I've been busy with work," I said, echoing the explanation she had apparently created. She frowned slightly. "No, that's not it. We argued about something, didn't we?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Dad had warned against correcting her, but this seemed like a moment of lucidity, a reaching for a truth her mind couldn't quite grasp. "We had a disagreement," I acknowledged carefully. She nodded slowly, her eyes clearing. "I've been forgetting things, Jessica," she said, her voice suddenly vulnerable in a way I'd never heard before. "Sometimes I get lost in my own home. Sometimes I say things I don't mean or can't remember saying." Her hand trembled as she placed a plate in the dishwasher. "Your father thinks I don't know what's happening to me, but I do. At least some of the time." Tears welled in my eyes. "Mom. Did I say something terrible to you?" she asked, her voice small. "Is that why you stayed away?" The raw vulnerability in her question disarmed me completely. "It doesn't matter now," I said gently, taking the plate from her shaking hands. "It does matter," she insisted, a flash of her old stubbornness breaking through. "I need to know what I did." I weighed my options quickly. Would the truth help or harm in this moment? "You were upset about my career choices," I said finally. "You said some hurtful things in the heat of the moment." She closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry, Jessica. I don't remember it, but I'm sorry. I am proud of you, you know. I tell my friends about your work." "Dad mentioned that," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "I keep a folder of your designs," she continued. "On my iPad. I show everyone. The logo you did for that coffee shop downtown? The one with the bird?" It's my favorite. I was stunned. The coffee shop logo was one of my earliest professional designs, something I'd never mentioned specifically to my parents. The fact that she not only knew about it but had saved it and showed it off to others completely contradicted the dismissive attitude she'd always displayed toward my career. I didn't know that, I said honestly. Mom's face clouded briefly. I suppose there's a lot we don't say to each other. She looked down at the dish in her hands as if suddenly unsure what she was doing. Are we loading or unloading? The moment of clarity had passed. Loading, Mom. We just finished dinner. Of course, she said, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. Jessica, would you check if your father needs help with whatever he's doing? It was her way of asking for space, I realized. The awareness of her condition must have returned, and with it, the desire not to let me see her struggle. I found Dad in his office, staring at insurance paperwork. When I told him about my conversation with Mom, tears filled his eyes. She has these moments of complete clarity, he said. They're becoming less frequent, but when they happen, it's like having her back completely. He set the papers aside. Did it help? To hear her say she's proud of you? It did, I admitted. But it also makes everything more complicated. The mother who's proud of me and the mother who told me to get out, they're the same person and not the same person at all. Dad nodded in understanding. That's exactly what living with this disease is like. Loving someone who is simultaneously themselves and not themselves. We were interrupted by Kyle, who appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. What's going on with Mom? He asked directly. She just asked Bethany if we're staying overnight, then got upset when Bethany reminded her we live 15 minutes away. Dad and I exchanged glances. It was time for the truth to come out. 1 month later, I sat in my new apartment downtown, the one my mother had initially objected to as unsafe. The move had been part of my commitment to building a life on my terms while still maintaining connections with my family. The extra space allowed me to set up a proper home office, and as promised, the commute to work was cut in half. The past month had brought significant changes for all of us. After our family dinner, Dad, Kyle, and I had a long overdue conversation about Mom's condition. Kyle had been shocked and hurt by the secrecy, but ultimately understood our mother's reluctance to burden him with her diagnosis. I'm a doctor, for God's sake, he'd said, frustration evident in his voice. I could have been helping all along. Together, we developed a family care plan. Kyle used his medical connections to get Mom into a specialized treatment program for early-onset dementia patients. Dad agreed to attend a support group for spouses of dementia patients, acknowledging he couldn't handle everything alone. And I took on the task of researching memory care options for the future, when home care would no longer be sufficient. The family dynamics shifted in unexpected ways. Kyle and I grew closer as we collaborated on our mother's care, breaking down the artificial barriers that had separated us for years. I saw my brother not as the golden child who could do no wrong, but as someone who shared my grief and concern, who brought different strengths to our family crisis. Dad, too, began to change. Forced out of his workaholic patterns by necessity, he became more present, more communicative. One evening, as we reviewed Mom's medication schedule together, he said something that stunned me. I've failed both you kids in different ways, he admitted. Kyle got all the pressure to succeed, and you got all the criticism. Neither of you got enough of my attention or protection. It was the most self-aware statement I'd ever heard from him, and it opened the door to a new kind of relationship between us, one based on honest communication rather than avoidance. As for Mom, her condition continued its unpredictable course. There were good days when she was almost her old self, and difficult days when she became confused, agitated, or couldn't recognize familiar objects. The outbursts like the one I'd experienced became more common, but now that we understood their source, they were easier to navigate. 2 weeks ago, during one of her clear moments, we had the conversation I'd been waiting for. I was helping her organize her closet, a task that had become overwhelming for her, when she suddenly sat down on the edge of the bed and patted the space beside her. I need to tell you something, Jessica, she said, her voice steady and clear. I remember what I said to you that night. About getting out and never coming back. My heart pounded as I sat beside her. You do? She nodded. It comes back in pieces sometimes. I remember being so angry, but I can't remember why. That happens a lot now, the emotions without the reasons behind them. She took my hand in hers. I need you to know that wasn't me speaking. Or not all of me. This disease, it takes the worst thoughts, the ones we'd normally never say aloud, and removes all the filters. I understand that now, I said gently. No, let me finish while I still can, she insisted. I've always been critical of you, Jessica. I see that now. I pushed you too hard because I saw so much potential in you, and I was afraid you'd waste it. But that's no excuse for making you feel less than wonderful, because you are wonderful. Tears filled her eyes. I've always been proud of you. Always. Even when I couldn't show it right. It was the apology and validation I'd been seeking my entire life, delivered at a moment when I least expected it. I held her tightly as we both cried, aware that this lucid version of my mother would appear less and less frequently as the disease progressed. I forgive you, Mom, I whispered. And I'm not going anywhere. In the weeks that followed, I developed new ways to connect with her that worked around her condition rather than against it. Instead of lengthy conversations that could confuse her, we looked through photo albums together, the visual cues helping to anchor her memories. Rather than discussing my work in abstract terms, I showed her designs on my tablet, focusing on colors and images she could respond to directly. Family therapy became a regular part of our lives. Kyle and I worked through years of unspoken resentment, his frustration at being the one who always had to be perfect, my hurt at being the one who never seemed good enough. Dad began to express emotions he'd suppressed for decades, revealing the fear and helplessness he felt watching his wife slowly slip away. I established clearer boundaries with all family members. I attended Sunday dinner twice a month rather than weekly, maintained my own living space instead of staying in my childhood bedroom during visits, and politely but firmly redirected conversations when they veered into territory that undermined my choices or independence. The most significant confrontation came with Kyle, who initially struggled to understand why I couldn't simply move back home to help care for Mom. You work from anywhere, he'd argued. I have hospital shifts and kids. It makes more sense for you to be there. That's not fair to anyone, I replied firmly. Mom needs professional care, not a daughter who resents being forced back into a caretaker role. I'll help on my terms, with reasonable boundaries. To my surprise, he eventually respected my position. You've changed, he observed one day after we'd interviewed another home health aide. You stand up for yourself now. I had to, I told him. This situation demanded it. Today, I was hosting a small gathering at my new apartment, a housewarming combined with a casual family lunch. It was the first time my family would be visiting my space rather than me going to theirs, a small but significant shift in our dynamic. Mom was having what we now called a middle day, not her best, but not her worst either. She recognized everyone but occasionally lost the thread of conversation or repeated questions. Dad stayed close to her, gently guiding her when needed. Kyle and Bethany had brought a housewarming gift, a beautiful set of cooking pots that acknowledged my love of culinary experimentation. As we sat around my new dining table, I looked at these people who had caused me such pain and provided such love, often in the same moment. The complexity of family relationships had never been clearer to me, how we can hurt those we love most, how forgiveness doesn't erase the past but creates space for a different future, how we can be both broken and healing simultaneously. Mom had a moment of confusion as we served dessert, looking around the unfamiliar apartment with panic in her eyes. Where are we? She asked, her voice tinged with fear. We're at Jessica's new place, honey, Dad explained gently. Remember? She moved downtown near her work. Mom frowned, struggling to place this information. Then her gaze fell on a framed photo on my bookshelf, one of her and me at my college graduation, both of us smiling broadly. Jessica, she said, her face clearing. This is your home. It wasn't a question but a statement of recognition. Yes, Mom, I said, taking her hand. And you're always welcome here. In that moment, I understood that while I couldn't control my mother's illness or change our complicated past, I could choose how to move forward. I could build a life that honored both my independence and my family connections, that acknowledged the pain without being defined by it. The road ahead would not be easy. Mom's condition would progress, bringing new challenges and heartaches. But we would face them together, as a family redefined by crisis but ultimately strengthened by it. Have you ever had to redefine your relationship with family after a painful experience? Did you find it possible to maintain your boundaries while still showing compassion? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you or might help someone else navigating complex family dynamics, please like, subscribe, and share. Remember, even in our most difficult family moments, understanding and compassion can lead to healing, though sometimes in ways we never expected. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you strength in your own family journey.